monarchs in Europe tended to rely on a hodgepodge of fighters, often mercenaries, and then this really shifted after the French Revolution in Europe. Tell us a little bit about that shift and why that cemented certain institutions.
Sure. Well, in Europe before the French Revolution, and the American Revolution is very important here as well, because it's an example, and a lot of Europeans pay attention to it. But in the 18th century and before, the people who were the officers tended to come from the upper classes, because that was just expected what you did if you were a young man from the upper classes. And otherwise, you used as ordinary soldiers people you didn't want for anything else. And so you wouldn't take a good farmer and make him into a soldier, because that person would be much better off farming and producing food for everyone else. In England, in the 18th century, if you were sent to jail, if you were going to be executed, for example, you were often given a choice of going to jail or being executed or joining the army, which tells you something about the sort of treatment and the expectations of ordinary soldiers. But the American Revolution and the French Revolution set in motion this idea that people are not subjects, they're citizens. In other words, they have a share in their own government, they help to choose their own government, and correspondingly they want to try and defend it. And the other thing that happened in the 19th century was the Industrial Revolution, which may have started in Europe but rapidly spread around the world. And it made it possible to move people in much larger numbers using things like railways and steamships, and then eventually the internal combustion engine and airplanes. And it made it possible to produce huge amounts of weapons, huge amounts of uniforms. It made it possible to have much bigger wars. And so you had motivation for war increasing with I think, nationalism and this notion that we're citizens and have to defend our own government and our own society. It's also possible to have much bigger wars, which is why the First and Second World Wars were so massive in scale.
And how did that correspond with Napoleon's rise in particular?
Napoleon was just at the beginning of this change, and he benefited from the newly awakened sense of French nationalism. And his soldiers felt they were fighting for a cause. They felt they were fighting for France, for liberty, equality, and fraternity. And they also saw themselves as missionaries. They were going to spread these ideas around Europe. And when they began to spread them, of course, they created opposition, and people said, well, actually, we're not French, but we have our own views. And so in a funny way, the French, by wanting to spread their ideas, actually increased nationalism among other people, which was often turned on them. But Napoleon was still fighting in the old way. He was in charge before modern technology had begun to make a huge difference. And so his soldiers had to march. And one of his real problems always was feeding them and keeping them supplied, which is why when he invaded Russia in 1812 with a massive army, he couldn't feed that army. And a lot of the soldiers who went with Napoleon to Russia died of starvation, not because the Russians killed them, although, of course, a lot of them were killed in fighting, too. So if Napoleon had commanded modern armies, say, in the 20th century, he would have been, I think, a very formidable commander indeed.
So kind of ahead of his time in that era. I mean, not to laud it, of course, but just in looking at it in a dispassionate way. And then probably spurring a lot of technological innovations with war as his influence crept across Europe, and wars of nationalism became a bit more normalized.
Yeah, well, war has always spurred technological innovation, because if you can get an edge on the enemy with a better weapon, with, say, a better type of metal, or a stronger bow that can fire further, or, of course, guns that are more efficient and fire further, then you have a real advantage. And so often countries have invested in technology for war, and in wartime that is often sped up. I mean, I think the development of airplanes, for example, and then the development of the jet engine was very much speeded up. It was probably going to happen anyway, but very much speeded up by war. And often governments and societies will spend money in war on investments in technology and science which they wouldn't spend in peacetime. You know, the example I often use is penicillin, which has saved literally millions of lives since it first began to be put into production. It was discovered how to make it at the end of the 1920s, but everyone thought it was too expensive. When the Second World War came, suddenly it wasn't too expensive. And I think we're seeing the same thing with the reaction to the COVID pandemic. What would have been too expensive before the pandemic started, the research, the production of the vaccines,
right,
became important.
Yes. And I mean, I guess to stay with Europe in that time, I mean, if we're moving to the UK, the East India Company, the usage of militarism in order to maintain global capitalism. How did that fit into war as influencing and spurring certain innovations and certain social structures?
Well, imperialism and colonialism, the settlement of peoples from Europe and elsewhere around the world, were really enabled by the dominance that European societies, and that includes, in fact, the United States, which very much benefited from this, the dominance they had in technology. And it wasn't a dominance that was going to last for long. It was a very brief period. I mean, before the beginning of the 19th century, China was probably as strong or stronger than most European countries. Japan was probably as strong or stronger. The Ottoman Empire was strong or stronger. But what happened in the course of the 19th century was that European countries, Western countries, developed this technological edge. And so they had better weapons when they went out to deal with the sorts of people they were trying to take over. It was a very, very unfair battle, very unfair advantage. And eventually, of course, what was going to happen is knowledge of the technology and ways of using it was going to spread. But it certainly is true that a lot of Western empires, and the expansion of the United States as well, were a result of war or depended on the war-making capacity of the powers that were carrying out this expansion.
And we modernized that technological innovation in the form of what we colloquially call the military-industrial complex, because I mean, still military technologies in the United States will ramp up, even though the money is constantly there, but will ramp up, and those industries will accumulate a lot of capital and growth during times of war.
Yeah, and it's something that President Eisenhower warned about in one of his last speeches. He said it can be dangerous. And I think what he was implying was every country needs to defend itself and should have defense industries, but it can be dangerous if the defense industries are too powerful and influence government in things like procurement. I mean, sometimes you get very effective lobbyists who say to governments, you must have this latest airplane or this latest weapon. Governments may not need it. And I think it's dangerous because sometimes huge amounts of money are spent on things which may not necessarily be in the best interests of the country. So I think Eisenhower was right there, that you have to really look critically at what it is you're trying to do and what sort of weapons you need, and not let the money, not let those be determined by the companies that are going to make money out of it. On the other hand, the investment in military things has often had big benefits for civilian society. I mean, a lot of the early investment which made the internet possible was done for military reasons, defense reasons, but of course it helped to spawn Silicon Valley and the world in which we now live.
And then Silicon Valley has become in and of itself its own danger, but I mean, I think that's sometimes just the nature of capitalism, and there's a way too that this can feed upon itself. If the money-making machine becomes so lucrative, then wartime can be more tantalizing for governments when there's an understanding that money can be had. Especially, I mean, we see this. I thought the Iraq War was a significant example of that.